The signal had no frequency it should have occupied. Dr. Marin Solis watched the waveform crawl across her terminal in the linguistics bay of the TCS Atherton, a heavy stealth cruiser 3 days into the Kavari expanse, and she could not reconcile what she was seeing with anything in 22 years of xenolinguistic fieldwork. The waveform did not repeat. It did not pulse. It breathed. Slow, arrhythmic exhalations of structured electromagnetic radiation that her software kept trying to classify as noise and kept failing, over and over, the error logs piling up like unanswered questions. Still no match. Commander Hadley stood behind her, arms crossed, his reflection ghosting the screen. Not even close. Marin enlarged the spectral analysis and rotated it, letting the harmonics fan out across the display in a shape that resembled nothing in her reference library. Not Kesari trade speech, not Hydrathi negotiation protocols, not any of the 11 confirmed xenolinguistic systems cataloged by the Solward Institute. It's not a beacon. Beacons repeat. It's not a distress call. Distress calls are designed to be found. This. She traced a finger along the waveform's spine, feeling the strangeness of it even through the glass. This is a conversation, one side of it. Hadley's jaw tightened. A conversation with what? That's the question worth answering, Commander. The Atherton had been dispatched to the Kavari expanse after a Terran deep range sensor array picked up what Fleet Intelligence classified as an anomalous emission event, a burst of structured energy from a region of space that, according to every survey on record, held nothing. No stars within 4 light years, no planets, no stations, no debris fields, no ancient marker buoys or derelict hulls or mining claims, just cold vacuum and a signal that should not have existed. Marin had been pulled from her post at the Solward Institute 3 days before departure. The summons had come with no explanation beyond a single line. Your expertise in non-standard signal morphology is required. She had canceled a semester of lectures, packed 1 bag, boarded a shuttle to the Atherton's berth at Soli Station, and met Commander Hadley for the first time on the bridge. He had looked at her the way line officers always looked at civilian specialists, a polite distrust wrapped in professional courtesy, the unspoken assessment that she would be in the way when things got serious. Now he looked at her differently. The signal had been running for 41 hours, and nothing in the ship's database, nothing in the collective knowledge of Terran xenolinguistics, could touch it. Marin was the only person aboard who had stopped calling it anomalous and started calling it deliberate. "I want to move closer," she said. Hadley's eyes narrowed. "We're at passive detection range. If we move closer, whatever's broadcasting that signal will know we're here. If it's a conversation, Commander, then there's a second party, and the second party is either nearby and already knows we're here, or far away and doesn't care. Either way, I need better resolution on the harmonic substructure. At this distance, I'm working with shadows. I can see that there's structure, but I can't read it. That's like knowing a letter exists but not being able to open the envelope." He studied her for a long 3 seconds, his eyes weighing something she could not read. Then he turned to the helm. Lieutenant Vosk, close to 40,000 kilometers, passive only, no active emissions of any kind. "Aye, Commander." The Atherton crept forward. Marin felt the faintest tremor through the deck as the maneuvering thrusters fired. A stealth cruiser's drives were built to be ghosts, vibration-dampened and heat-masked, but no amount of engineering could eliminate every physical signature. She pressed her palms flat on the console and waited, watching the signal resolution counter climb as the distance shrank. At 40,000 kilometers, the signal sharpened, and Marin's throat went dry. The waveform was not one signal. It was 3, woven into a braid so tight her software had read them as a single thread. 3 distinct channels, 3 distinct structures, 3 distinct, she hesitated to use the word, but there was no other voices, and they were not speaking the same language. She pulled up a fresh analysis window and began the painstaking work of separating them, peeling one channel from another with spectral filters calibrated to each thread's unique modulation signature. Channel 1 was dense, mathematical, its structure built on prime number intervals that repeated in sequences she recognized from computational logic, Fibonacci progressions, power of two branching, the universal fingerprints of a mind that thought in numbers before it thought in anything else. Channel 2 was fluid, almost organic, its modulations resembling nothing so much as the tonal shifts in cetacean communication, but faster, compressed, urgent, as if whatever was speaking had too much to say and not enough signal to carry it. Channel 3 was the one that made the hair on her arms stand. Channel 3 was silent. Not absent, not dead air. Silent in the way a held breath is silent, a structured gap where something should have been speaking and was choosing not to. The channel was active. Its carrier wave was live, humming with baseline energy. But whatever was supposed to be talking on it had stopped, deliberately, recently enough that the other two channels were still addressing it, still shaping their statements as if expecting a response that was not coming. "Commander," Marin kept her voice level with an effort that cost her more than she would have admitted. "We have 3 participants in this conversation. 2 are active. The third has gone quiet." Hadley leaned over her shoulder, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "Gone quiet how?" "The channel is open. The entity on the other end is present, its carrier wave is live, its signal architecture is intact. It's just listening." "Listening to what?" "To the other two." She met his eyes in the screen's reflection. "Or to us, I can't rule that out." A beat of silence on the bridge. The tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Price, spoke without turning from her console. "Passive sensors show no contacts within detection range. If something's out there, it's running colder than the cosmic microwave background. Or it's better at hiding than we are," Hadley said quietly. He turned back to Marin. "Dr. Solis, what do you need?" "Time, and permission to run a full linguistic decomposition on channels 1 and 2. If I can find structure, grammar, syntax, anything that functions as a semantic unit, I can start building a translation framework. But I need to record at least 6 hours of continuous signal at this resolution to have enough data for pattern extraction." "You have 4, make them count." Marin didn't argue. She pulled her chair closer to the console, loaded her decomposition suite, a software package she had spent 11 years building, tested against every known xenolinguistics system in the Terran catalog, and went to work. The first hour gave her the architecture of Channel 1. It was a formal language, rigid, positional, its meaning encoded in the placement of elements within fixed frames. Every statement occupied exactly the same temporal length, padded with null intervals to fill the structure like a form with mandatory fields. It was the language of a mind that thought in grids, in matrices, in absolute positions. A machine intelligence, or something so close to one that the distinction collapsed under scrutiny. Marin had encountered machine languages before. The Hydrathi trade networks used automated negotiation protocols that bore a superficial resemblance, fixed-length packets, positional encoding, deterministic responses. But those were tools. Scripted exchanges with no generative capacity, no ability to construct novel statements. Channel 1 was different. Channel 1 was constructing original assertions in real time, adapting its categorical frames to accommodate new data, revising its own previous statements based on input from Channel 2. This was not a program running a script. This was a mind reasoning, thinking, reaching conclusions and then questioning them. And its reasoning was fast, faster than anything biological could match. Every assertion took exactly 1.3 seconds, and the assertions were stacking, building a model of something, accumulating data points with the relentless efficiency of a system designed to know everything about a subject before the subject knew it was being studied. Marin counted 47 assertions in the first hour. Each one added a new parameter to the model. Each one brought the machine closer to a conclusion it had not yet reached. Channel 2 was Channel 1's opposite in every measurable way. Fluid, recursive, layered. Meaning was carried not in position but in relation. The way one element modified another. The way a phrase folded back on itself to recontextualize what came before. The way a cascade of subordinate clauses could retroactively change the meaning of the main clause. It was the most complex natural language structure Marin had ever encountered, and she had spent 6 years of her career decoding the trade speech of the Kesari, a species whose grammar operated in 4 temporal dimensions simultaneously. Channel 2 made the Kesari look like a children's primer. But it was Channel 3 that consumed her. The silence was not empty. As Marin refined her instruments, increasing the sensitivity of her phase detection algorithms by 3 orders of magnitude, she began to detect micro-fluctuations in the carrier wave. Not transmissions, not signals, perturbations. Tiny, almost subliminal shifts in the wave's phase and amplitude that corresponded, she realized with growing unease, to the content of the other 2 channels. When Channel 1 made a declarative statement, Channel 3's carrier wave shifted by a fraction of a degree, always in the same direction, always by a proportional amount. When Channel 2 posed what Marin was beginning to interpret as a question, Channel 3's phase wobbled differently. A distinct pattern, a different cognitive response. Channel 3 was reacting. It was processing what it heard, and it was doing so in a way that left traces, fingerprints of cognition pressed into the electromagnetic substrate of its own carrier wave, like the impression of a hand in wet clay. Whatever was on Channel 3 was thinking, and it did not want to be heard doing so. "Commander, I need to report something." Marin's voice was calm, but her hands had stopped moving on the console and her pulse was running faster than the bridge's air recyclers could explain. Channel 3 isn't a passive listener. It's an active cognitive presence that's deliberately withholding communication. It's hearing everything the other 2 are saying. It's processing it in real time, and it's choosing silence. Hadley stood very still. The bridge lights caught the silver at his temples. What kind of entity does that? One that's waiting for something. For what? I don't know yet, but channels 1 and 2 have been accelerating. The conversation is getting faster, more compressed. The intervals between assertions on Channel 1 have dropped from 1.3 seconds to 1.1. Channel 2's recursive depth is increasing, more layers per statement, more meaning packed into each transmission. Whatever they're discussing, they're approaching a decision point. And Channel 3 is listening to see what they decide. Price spoke up from tactical, her voice carrying the clipped precision of a woman who did not waste words. "Commander, I'm picking up a thermal bloom. Bearing 271 Mark 04 range. Range uncertain. The signature is diffuse. It's not a drive plume. It's more like radiated heat from a large surface that's been running cold and is warming up." How large? At least 12 kilometers across. Possibly significantly larger. The thermal gradient is very shallow, and I'm only seeing the warmest portions. Whatever it is, it's barely above background. If we weren't at this range, if we hadn't closed to 40,000, we would never have seen it. Marin's stomach tightened. 12 kilometers. The number landed with the weight of a physical thing. A Terran dreadnought, the largest warship humanity fielded, the pride of the fleet, the ship that made admirals feel safe, was 3.8 kilometers bow to stern. Whatever was out there was 3 times that size, at minimum, and it was running so cold it was nearly invisible against the void. "That's Channel 3, Marin said. She knew it before she could justify it logically, before she could point to the data correlation on her screen. The timing was too precise. The thermal bloom had appeared at the exact moment Channel 3's carrier wave perturbations had shifted into a new, more active pattern. That's the one that's listening." Hadley turned to Price. "Can you resolve it? Shape, composition, anything?" "Negative. At this thermal differential, I'm getting rough shape estimates at best. It's elongated, irregular, not a geometric hull form. Not any manufactured profile in our database. Price hesitated, and Marin heard the professional uncertainty in that pause, the disciplined officer's reluctance to say something she could not prove. It looks organic, Commander. The word landed on the bridge like a stone dropped into still water. Organic. A 12-kilometer organic structure, running cold in empty space, listening to a conversation between a machine intelligence and something that spoke in recursive fluid grammar, and choosing to say nothing while all three of them debated the fate of a species that had just arrived. I need more time, Marin said. You have what I gave you, work faster. She dove back in. Channel 1, the machine language, was the easier of the two to crack, and its rigidity was its vulnerability. Within 90 minutes, Marin had isolated 216 distinct semantic units and mapped their positional relationships into a crude but functional grammar. The machine was making assertions, categorical statements about classification, capability, threat assessment, resource potential. It was evaluating something with the thoroughness of a system that had been built, or had built itself, to leave nothing unexamined. And the checklist was about them. Marin found the reference on the 43rd assertion, a cluster of semantic units that, when mapped through her emerging framework, translated roughly to new, unclassified, origin sector, unknown, cognitive architecture, indeterminate, threat potential, indeterminate, resource value, indeterminate. Recommended action, observe, do not engage. They're talking about us, Marin said, and the words came out flat, stripped of everything but controlled professional surprise. Channel 1 is a machine intelligence performing a threat assessment on the Atherton, on humanity. Every assertion it's made in the last 90 minutes has been building a classification model for our species, and the model keeps returning indeterminate. We're breaking its categories. Behind her, she heard the bridge crew absorb that. The slight shift of bodies in chairs, the sound of Price adjusting her tactical display. The silence of people who had trained for first contact in simulations, and were discovering that the simulations had not prepared them for the weight of being studied by something they could not see. What are we categorized as? Hadley asked. Indeterminate, across every parameter. They know we're here, they know we're technological, they know we're stealth capable, but they can't figure out what we want. That's the variable their model can't resolve, and it's preventing classification. And Channel 2, what's the second voice saying? Marin turned to the fluid language. It was harder by an order of magnitude. The recursive structure resisted linear decomposition. Every phrase modified every other phrase, creating meaning through interference patterns rather than sequential logic. Parse one layer and the layer beneath it changed meaning. Pin down a semantic unit and it shifted when the surrounding units shifted. It was a language designed by minds that did not think in straight lines. But she found purchase in the emotional register. The fluid language carried affect, not embedded in word choice the way human languages did it, not encoded as lexical items with emotional valence, but in the waveform itself. The physical shape of the modulation, its peaks, its valleys, its rate of change, encoded something that functioned like tone, like urgency, like the tremor in a voice when the speaker is trying to stay calm and failing. Like fear. Channel 2 was afraid, not of the Atherton. The fear predated their arrival. Marin traced it back through 2 hours of recordings and found it constant, unvarying. A baseline anxiety threaded through every statement and every question like the hum of a live wire. Channel 2 was afraid of Channel 3, and Channel 2 had been afraid for a very long time. Marin ran a temporal analysis on the fear signature, tracing its amplitude across the recording. It was not constant in the way she had first thought. It oscillated, rising when Channel 3's cognitive perturbations intensified, falling when the vast entity's attention seemed directed elsewhere. Channel 2 was monitoring Channel 3, the way a prey animal monitors a predator, not with panic. With the chronic, wearing vigilance of a species that had lived in the shadow of something incomprehensibly larger for generations, perhaps centuries, perhaps longer. She flagged the pattern for Hadley but kept digging. The recursive grammar was beginning to yield fragments, not full sentences, not yet, but structural motifs she could recognize. Repetitions, refrains. Channel 2 returned to certain recursive patterns the way a human speaker returns to key arguments in a debate, restating them from different angles, wrapping them in new subordinate clauses, approaching the same point from above and below and sideways. The point it kept returning to was a single concept that Marin could not yet translate but could feel the shape of a heavy, load-bearing idea at the center of Channel 2's argument, the fulcrum on which everything else balanced. She marked it in her notes as concept alpha and moved on, trusting that more data would resolve it. Lieutenant Commander Price broke her concentration. "Commander, I'm reading a second thermal anomaly. Bearing 093, range 62,000. Much smaller than the first, maybe 800 meters. Consistent with a manufactured structure. Running cold but not as cold as the primary contact." Hadley straightened. "A ship. Possibly, or a station, or a relay. Whatever it is, it's been here long enough to reach thermal equilibrium with the background. This wasn't placed yesterday." Marin looked up from her console. "That's Channel 1, the machine intelligence. It has a physical platform and we're close enough to see it now." "Two contacts," Hadley murmured. "One organic 17 kilometers, one manufactured 800 meters, and a third participant we can't localize, Channel 2, the frightened one. Where is Channel 2 broadcasting from?" Marin checked. The signal triangulation placed Channel 2's origin at a bearing that pointed to empty space, no thermal bloom, no detectable mass, nothing. Either Channel 2 was broadcasting from much farther away, beyond the Atherton's passive detection range, or it was using a relay system that masked its true position. "I can't find it," Marin admitted. "Channel 2 is either very far away or very well hidden. Given the signal strength, I'd guess the former. It's broadcasting from distance, participating in this deliberation remotely. So we have a machine platform nearby, a 17-kilometer organism nearby, and a terrified organic species somewhere far away, all arguing about us." Hadley's voice was dry, but Marin heard the edge beneath it. "And they've been doing this for 41 hours, since before we arrived." "Since before we arrived," Marin confirmed. "The conversation started when the sensor array first detected the anomalous emission. Our array picked up the signal, but the signal may have been triggered by our array's passive scan. They detected us detecting them." The implication settled over the bridge like a change in air pressure. They had known the Atherton was coming. The entire conversation, the machine's classification model, Channel 2's plea for contact, Channel 3's loaded silence, had been about the approaching human ship. The debate had been running for nearly 2 days, with the Atherton as its subject, and neither Marin nor anyone aboard had known until this moment. "The fluid speaker is frightened," Marin reported. "The fear isn't directed at us. It's directed at the third presence, the organic mass running cold out there. Channel 2 has been afraid of Channel 3 for as long as we've been recording. I suspect much longer." Hadley processed that with the visible discipline of a man who had commanded warships for 20 years and had learned to think before reacting. 3 entities out here in empty space. 1 machine cataloging us and returning errors. 1 organic species terrified of its neighbor. And a 12-kilometer biological mass sitting in the dark, thinking. And we wandered into the middle of it. "We didn't wander, Commander. We were sent. Someone picked up that signal and decided it was worth investigating. Now we know why. What's Channel 2 arguing for?" Marin worked the decomposition for another 20 minutes, cross-referencing fragments of the recursive grammar against the emotional register, building a parallel structure that let her infer semantic content from effective shape. The recursive grammar fought her at every turn, folding meaning inside meaning inside meaning, each layer dependent on every other layer for context, each clause a mirror that reflected and distorted every clause around it. And then she found it, the core argument, the thing Channel 2 had been saying in layer upon layer of desperate eloquence for the entire duration of their recording. Channel 2 was arguing that the Atherton, that humanity, should not be classified as a threat. Channel 2 was arguing for contact, real contact, not the cold observation Channel 1 was recommending, not the silent assessment Channel 3 had been conducting. Contact, communication, the radical, terrifying, unprecedented act of actually talking to the unknown species that had appeared in their space. And Channel 3, the vast presence running dark and cold in the void, had not yet decided whether to allow it. Marin pulled up the machine's assertion log and ran it backward, looking for context. The classification model Channel 1 had been building was not just about humanity. It was a standard template, a form the machine applied to every new contact. And in the margins of the form, in the null padding that surrounded each assertion, Marin found ghosts, residual data, fragments of previous assessments that had not been fully cleared from the machine's working memory. She counted 12 distinct assessment profiles, 12 species, encountered and classified at some point in the machine's operational history. Each one had been evaluated on the same parameters: origin, cognitive architecture, social structure, technological tier, threat posture. Each one had been assigned a final classification. Every single one had been classified as threat. Not varying degrees of threat, not low threat, moderate threat, high threat, binary, threat or not threat. And every species the machine had ever assessed had fallen on the same side of the line. Marin felt the significance of that settle into her like cold water. The machine's model was not designed to identify allies. It was not designed to find partners or trade contacts or diplomatic opportunities. It was designed to identify threats, and it had never, in what appeared to be a very long operational history, encountered a species it classified as anything else. Until now, until intent, understand had broken the model and forced the machine to return indeterminate for the first time in its existence. "Commander," Marin said, and something in her voice made Hadley turn immediately. "The machine has assessed 12 species before us. Every one of them was classified as a threat. Every single one. We are the first species in its operational history to return an indeterminate classification. And I think that's why Channel 2 is so desperate for this to work. Because if the machine classifies us as a threat, its 13th threat in a row, then Channel 3 may never speak again. To anyone." The weight of that landed on the bridge. Not just first contact with one entity, not just a three-way deliberation about humanity's place in the cosmos, a species-level audition, a last chance for something that had been waiting for a different answer for longer than human history. Hadley absorbed that in silence. Then he said very quietly, "So this isn't just about us." "No, Commander. This is about whether the entity ever tries again, whether it keeps its seam open or closes it and goes back to silence, permanent silence. We're not just representing humanity. We're representing the possibility that communication between radically different minds is worth attempting." She paused. "We're the test case for whether loneliness is the default condition of intelligence in this universe." Hadley looked at the entity on the main display. 17 kilometers of ancient thought, wrapped in mineral and flesh, its pores breathing their slow, independent rhythms, its seam still sealed, its light still hidden, waiting for the machine to finish its classification, waiting to find out if this species, this small, mortal, stealth-capable species that had wandered into the most important conversation in the galaxy's recent history, would be the 13th threat in a row. Or something else entirely. Then we'd better make sure the machine gets it right, Hadley said. Transmit when ready, Dr. Solus. And for what it's worth, I hope your broken word does what you think it'll do. Commander, Marin turned from her console. We're witnessing an internal deliberation. 3 entities, a machine intelligence, an organic species, and a third presence we can't classify, are deciding what to do about us. Right now, in real time, Channel 2 is pleading our case, making the argument that we deserve contact, not just observation. Channel 1 is withholding judgment, running its models, returning errors. And Channel 3, she looked at the thermal bloom on the tactical display. Channel 3 is the deciding vote, and it hasn't voted yet. Hadley's knuckles whitened on the chair back. The deciding vote is a 12-kilometer organism we can barely detect. Yes. The bridge fell quiet enough that Marin could hear the soft cycle of the air recyclers and the distant hum of the Atherton's reactor through 4 decks of armor plating. She could feel the weight of command pressing on Hadley, 147 crew, the balance between discovery and survival, and the knowledge that every decision he made in the next hour would be studied by Fleet Command for decades. Can we communicate with them? He asked. I can build a response framework for Channel 1. Its grammar is rigid enough that I can construct a basic declarative statement, an identification, a categorization of ourselves in its own format. Channel 2 is beyond my ability to replicate. The recursive structure would take months to model convincingly. And Channel 3 isn't speaking. I can't respond to silence. What would you say to Channel 1? Marin thought. 22 years of xenolinguistic theory pressed against the inside of her skull, and she set all of it aside. Theory was for journals and comfortable offices and the quiet luxury of time. This was the void, and 3 minds were listening, and one of them was deciding the fate of a conversation that might define humanity's place in a region of space where no Terran vessel had ever ventured. The machine wanted categories. It wanted data. She could give it that. I would identify us. Species, origin, cognitive architecture, the same parameters it's using to assess us. Fill in the blanks in its classification model. Give it what it's looking for so it can stop returning indeterminate and start processing. And if it classifies us as a threat, then we learn that before they act on the classification. Better to know what the jury thinks than to sit in the dark while it deliberates. Hadley stared at her for 3 full seconds. She watched the decision form, not impulsive, not reckless, but the hard, clear-eyed calculation of a man who understood that passivity in this silence was its own kind of danger. Construct your response, Dr. Solus. Do not transmit until I authorize it. Marin built it in 38 minutes. 312 semantic units arranged in the machine's own positional grammar, each one placed with the precision of a watchmaker setting jewels. She identified humanity, carbon BASED, HOMEWRLD, third orbital body G-type star, spectral class G-V, cognitive architecture, neural individual consciousness, parallel processing capable, social structure, hierarchical collaborative, technological tier, interstellar, faster than light capable, stealth capable. Threat posture, observational. She gave them everything Channel 1 was trying to determine on its own, laid out clean and categorical in the machine's own language. But she added one element the machine had not asked for, one semantic unit that did not fit any of its assessment categories. One concept that existed in no positional frame the machine had used across 216 assertions. She added intent, understand. It was not a word in the machine's language. She had to construct it from adjacent concepts, purpose crossed with cognitive process crossed with open query. It was awkward. It was imprecise. It was, in the machine's rigid grammar, a malformed statement, a syntactic error carrying a semantic payload that did not belong in any of the machine's existing categories. And that was exactly the point. A perfect response would have been processed and filed and forgotten. An error demanded interpretation. An error forced the machine to stop sorting and start thinking, to step outside its own framework, and ask what this strange, broken assertion was trying to say. "Ready," Marin said. Hadley examined her work on the screen, the waveform she had built, the translation matrix beside it, the 3-channel braid still flowing in real time. Channel 1 still cataloging. Channel 2 still pleading. Channel 3 still silent. He held the moment for 2 seconds, then transmit. Marin pressed the key. The response went out on Channel 1's frequency, in Channel 1's grammar, at Channel 1's modulation depth. It slid into the 3-voice conversation like a 4th voice entering a room where only 2 had been speaking and 1 had been listening. Channel 1 stopped. The rigid, categorical assertion ceased mid-frame, cut off as cleanly as a switch thrown. For 6.2 seconds, Marin counted everyone, her heart marking time. Nothing moved on any channel. The braid went flat. 3 intelligences and 1 human ship, suspended in mutual silence. Then Channel 1 resumed, but the assertions were gone. In their place, questions. Rapid, dense, stacking one query on top of another without waiting for answers, the machine's rigid grammar straining at its own edges as it tried to construct interrogatives its framework had not been designed to generate. Intent, understand, was the fault line. The machine had no category for it. It could classify threat. It could classify observation. It could classify withdrawal, aggression, calculation, deception, and 17 other relational postures Marin had identified in its grammar. But a species that announced its intent to understand, that named comprehension itself as its purpose, its reason for being in this space, its answer to the unasked question of why it had come, did not fit. And a machine that encounters data it cannot classify does not ignore it. It interrogates it. It takes the model apart and rebuilds it until the data fits, or until the model breaks, whichever comes first. Channel 2 erupted. The fluid, recursive language accelerated into something Marin could barely track, layers of meaning folding over each other in cascading sequences, the recursive depth jumping from 7 layers to 12 to 19 in the space of seconds. Her decomposition suite flagged the emotional register as elevated past any baseline she had recorded. Not fear, not anymore, something adjacent to excitement, relief, vindication. Channel 2 had heard humanity's response, and it was reacting not to the categorical data, species, homeworld, technological tier, all the clean machine-readable facts, but to the one concept it recognized across the species barrier. Understand. The organic speaker knew what that word meant, even wrapped in machine grammar, even broken and awkward and imprecise. And it was wielding it like evidence before a judge. The recursive layers cascaded with something Marin could only interpret as urgent argument. See, the waveform seemed to say, they didn't say conquer, they didn't say assess, they didn't say observe or threaten or withdraw, they said understand, they came here to understand. Marin's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the console, feeling the cool polymer surface against her palms, and she breathed through it the way she had learned to breathe through the vertigo that came with translating a language for the first time, the disorientation of stepping outside every framework you've ever built and finding that the universe was larger than your models. Price's voice cut through, "Commander, the thermal contact is changing." Every head on the bridge turned. Price's tactical display showed the diffuse thermal bloom contracting, sharpening, resolving from a vague warm smear into something with contour and dimension. The temperature was rising. Not fast, not a drive ignition, not a weapon charge, nothing that would have triggered the Atherton's threat response protocols, but steadily, deliberately, like an animal that had been holding perfectly still and was now allowing itself to be seen. "I'm getting shape resolution," Price said. Her voice had shifted to the careful, measured register of an officer reporting something she could not explain and was not going to speculate about. "Commander, it's not a ship. It's not a station." It's not any manufactured profile in our database. I don't have a classification for what I'm seeing. Put it on the main display. The forward screen shifted from the empty starfield to a thermal overlay, false color rendering in blues and purples and rising ambers, and every person on the bridge saw it at the same time. It was alive. The shape was irregular, asymmetric, vast, 17 kilometers. Price's revised estimate scrolling across the bottom of the display in digits that seemed too large to be real. Its outline branched and folded like the canopy of an ancient tree rendered in flesh and mineral, reaching in half a dozen directions as if the void itself were soil, and the entity had rooted in it over millennia. There were no hard edges, no hull plates, no antenna arrays or weapon emplacements or engine nacelles. There were ridges and valleys and what looked like pores, vast openings in its surface, each one dozens of meters across, each one pulsing with faint thermal glow in its own independent rhythm. Breathing. Each one breathing. Its surface texture was layered, geological, biological, like coral grown over centuries on the skeleton of something that had once been even larger. A structure built by accretion and patience and time measured in eons rather than years. And it was turning, slowly with the ponderous deliberation of something that had not moved in a very long time. The vast shape was rotating, orienting, bringing its largest surface to bear on the Atherton, not randomly, not drifting, turning the way a creature turns when something, after an endless wait, has finally warranted its attention. Marin understood, with a certainty that bypassed analysis and landed in her bones like a struck bell, that it was turning to face them. Channel 3 was no longer silent. The carrier wave that had held only perturbations, fingerprints of cognition, traces of thought pressed into electromagnetic clay, was now carrying a structured signal. But the signal was not like Channel 1's rigid assertions or Channel 2's fluid recursions. It was something Marin had never encountered in any database, any fieldwork, any theoretical model, any late-night speculation session at the Solward Institute. It was a question. A single structured emission lasting 4.7 seconds. Her software failed to parse it because it did not match any linguistic framework in the Terran catalog. It was not positional. It was not recursive. It was not mathematical or tonal or symbolic in any recognizable way. It was spatial. The signal encoded three-dimensional information, not a diagram or a map or a coordinate set, but something more fundamental, a spatial relationship. 2 points in space defined precisely by their relative positions, one where the Atherton sat, one where the entity breathed, and between them a field of structured absence. Not emptiness, not void, potential. The space between them described not as distance but as possibility. The signal asked, in the only language that could cross every barrier of biology and cognition and culture and time, what exists between us? Marin stared at the display. Her training, her degrees, her years of field work, the 11 languages she had decoded, and the 4 she had helped construct, none of it had prepared her for a question asked in geometry. A question that did not want a classification or a threat assessment or a label from a machine's checklist. A question that wanted to know what kind of relationship was possible between two minds that had never shared a single concept until this very moment. Dr. Solis, Hadley's voice came from what felt like a great distance. What is it saying? It's asking us who we are, not what we are who. Not our species, not our technology, not our threat level. It wants to know what kind of relationship is possible between us, between its mind and ours. How do you answer that? You don't answer it in words, Commander. Not in any language anyone has ever spoken. You answer it in what you do next. 17 kilometers of living structure hung in the void ahead of them, its vast pores glowing with slow thermal breath, its entire attention focused on the stealth cruiser, and the species inside it that had broken a machine's categories with a single malformed word. Hadley looked at her, Not at the display, not at the tactical overlay, at her. What do you recommend? She made a decision, not a calculated one, not a theoretically defensible one. A decision born from the place where 22 years of listening to alien signals had taught her that the most important act of communication was never what you said. It was the space you left for the other to speak. I want to answer it on its own terms, in spatial grammar, and I know what to say. Do it. She built the response in 11 minutes, 2 points in space, the same two the entity had defined, and between them she placed not a word, not a concept, not a classification. She placed an opening, a structured absence where meaning should have been, a gap that said, this space is not yet defined. What fills it is what we build together. Transmitting, Hadley nodded. The signal went out. The bridge held its breath. The entity received it. Its thermal signature pulsed, one deep fluctuation rolling across all 17 kilometers of surface like a heartbeat visible from space. 3 seconds of stillness. Then it opened. Running from what Marin's mind insisted on calling the crown to what it insisted on calling the base, though the entity had no top or bottom in any meaningful sense. A seam appeared along the entity's facing surface, a deliberate parting, like an eye that had been closed for longer than human civilization had existed. It widened, and from within poured light, not thermal radiation, not reflected starlight. Something Marin's instruments registered as coherent, structured, and impossibly information-dense. More data in its first second than every library on Earth combined. And the data was a language. A new language, one that had never existed before that moment, constructed in real time, built from the intersection of two transmission styles. Spatial grammar from the entity, semantic intent from Marin, merged into something neither could have produced alone, a first language for a first conversation. The bridge erupted in quiet, controlled chaos. Price was calling out data rates. The entity was transmitting at bandwidths that exceeded the Atherton's receiver design specs, and the overflow was being buffered and compressed, and in some cases simply lost, terabytes of data sliding through their instruments like water through fingers. Ensign Dara at navigation had locked the ship's orientation to keep the primary receiver array aligned with the entity's seam, a task that required constant micro-adjustments as the entity's light shifted and pulsed. Hadley issued orders with the calm of a man who had decided to treat the unprecedented as a tactical problem. Route all secondary processing power to the linguistics bay. Pull non-essential systems if you have to. Dr. Solis, tell me what you need and you'll have it. I need the secondary quantum processor array, Marin said without looking up. Her hands were moving across the console with a speed that surprised even her. The decomposition suite was adapting faster than she had thought possible, finding patterns in the hybrid grammar at a rate that suggested the language had been designed to be learnable, designed to meet a human mind halfway. And I need everyone on this bridge to be quiet for the next 10 minutes. The bridge went silent. Even the air recyclers seemed to hush. Marin's decomposition suite found purchase in the familiar half, the semantic structures she had embedded in her response, and used those as anchors to decode the spatial half. She could read it, not perfectly, but she could read it, and it was getting clearer with every second as the language bootstrapped itself. It's speaking to us in a language it just created, she said, half our grammar, half its own. The first complete translation came at the 4-minute mark. A statement, not a question, not an assertion, not a command. A statement of being. The entity was telling them that it existed, that it was here, that it was aware of them and they of it, and that this mutual awareness was, in itself, a new thing in the universe. Marin spoke the translation aloud, not because anyone had asked, but because the words needed to exist in the air of the bridge, needed to be heard by human ears and not just processed by software. It says, I am here, you are there, between us something new. The simplicity of it, hit harder than complexity could have. Every person on the bridge heard it, and every one of them understood, in the way you understand things that bypass language entirely, that they were witnesses to something that had not happened before and would not happen again in exactly this way. Channel 1's machine intelligence was running at processing speeds Marin had never seen, its rigid framework straining to accommodate the hybrid language, its categorical system expanding and contracting as it tried to classify what the entity was doing. The machine was failing. It had no category for linguistic creation. It had no framework for generosity. Channel 2's organic speaker had begun transmitting again, softly, its recursive layers carrying a single emotional register that Marin could now identify with confidence. Not fear. Not hope, the recursive language equivalent of weeping with relief. The hybrid language poured through the receivers, and Marin translated. It came in waves, layered meanings building on each other like harmonics on a fundamental tone. The entity was telling them what it was, not a species, not a civilization, a mind, a single vast ancient mind that had drifted through this region of space for longer than Earth's sun had burned. It had listened. For eons, it had listened. Radio chatter of younger intelligences, machine and organic, washing over it like rain on stone. It had watched Channel 1's machine intelligence evolve from calculating engines to self-aware networks. It had watched Channel 2's organic species develop language and fill the void with fear and beauty. And it had watched 1,000 other species rise and contact each other and fall. Every first contact between every pair ending the same way, in classification, in hierarchy, in the cold arithmetic of who was stronger and who would submit. Every species answered the question, what exists between us? Identically. A power relationship. So the entity had stopped asking. Millennia ago, it went quiet, it watched, it waited without hope for something it had never encountered. Until a small mortal mind in a stealth cruiser answered its question with an empty space and said, "Let's find out together." It stopped talking to other species, Marin told Hadley, her voice rough with the weight of real-time translation and the meaning of what she was translating. Thousands of years ago. It decided every mind it met would answer the same way, with threat assessment, with hierarchy, so it went silent, and it waited for someone who would answer differently. Channel 1's machine intelligence had gone still, its models insufficient, its queries suspended. Channel 2's organic speaker had fallen quiet, its fear replaced by the stunned silence of a witness watching something it had hoped for and never believed would happen. The entity continued. It asked about Earth in a transmission that carried the weight of genuine curiosity, not the machine's clinical data gathering, but something warmer, more personal, the interest of a mind that wanted to know not what humanity possessed, but what humanity experienced. It asked not coordinates or military capability, but what the sky looked like from the surface, what water sounded like, what it felt like to be small and temporary and alive. Marin answered with memory. Rain on the lab roof at the Solward Institute. Morning light through east windows turning dust motes to gold. Coffee at 4 a.m. with a translation finally breaking open, and the world outside dark and patient. She encoded it all in hybrid grammar, spatial relationships describing not positions but experiences. The entity received it and sent back its own existence, the slow wheel of galaxies, the patience of dark matter pressing against its body, the loneliness of understanding everything and being understood by nothing. For so long that solitude had become the architecture of thought itself. Marin realized she was crying. She wiped her face and kept working. Hours passed. The bridge crew rotated. At the third hour of continuous translation, Marin felt her concentration fray at the edges, the kind of cognitive fatigue that came from operating at the boundary of comprehension for too long without rest. She ate a protein bar that someone placed beside her console. She drank water. She stood and stretched for 30 seconds while the decomposition suite processed a dense transmission. And in those 30 seconds, she looked around the bridge and saw something she had not expected. The fear was gone. Not managed, not suppressed, not overridden by discipline. Gone. Replaced by the quiet, attentive stillness of people in the presence of something they did not fully understand but had decided to trust. It was the posture of witnesses. The posture of crew who understood they were seeing something that would be remembered long after they were not. Hadley had not left the bridge. He stood near the forward display, watching the entity's light pour through the void, and Marin saw on his face an expression she had never seen on a line officer. The look of a man who had spent his career preparing for conflict and had found something larger than conflict waiting for him in the dark. The bridge crew rotated, Price relieved by Keel, Vosk by Dara, but Marin stayed. The hybrid language evolved with every exchange, each concept bootstrapping the next. The entity asked about music. The transmission arrived as a spatial structure of unusual delicacy, 3 interlocking reference points that Marin interpreted as a question about organized sound, but organized in a way that suggested the entity already knew something about frequency and harmonics from its own existence. What it wanted to understand was not the physics but the experience. What happened inside a human mind when frequencies aligned in certain ratios? What the chest felt like when harmony pressed against it from the inside? Why a species would organize vibrations in the air into patterns that served no survival function and call the result beautiful? Marin had never been asked to explain music to a non-human intelligence. She had never considered how much of it was untranslatable, not because the concepts were complex, but because they were so deeply embedded in human neurology that separating the experience from the biology was like trying to describe color to a species that perceived the electromagnetic spectrum as texture. She tried anyway. She described the way a minor chord created a physical sensation of weight in the sternum, the way a melody could trigger memory with a precision that no other stimulus matched, a 4-note sequence that instantly transported you to a specific afternoon in a specific room with specific light falling on specific hands. The way music created an emotional state that had no name in any human language, a feeling that was not happiness and not sadness, but something that contained both and transcended both, a feeling that humans had been trying to name for 10,000 years, and had settled on calling beauty because nothing else came close. The entity listened, and then it described its own version, and she described the experience of harmony, and it responded with gravitational waves from colliding neutron stars rippling through its body over centuries. The entity asked about death, not the biology but the knowing, what it meant to carry awareness of your own ending in every waking moment. Marin thought about her mother, who had died 7 years ago in Meridian City, who had spent her last afternoon asking Marin to read from a linguistics textbook because she liked the sound of her daughter's voice explaining things. Marin sent that memory, and the entity's heartbeat slowed for 11 seconds in what she could only interpret as reverence. The entity did not know death. Marin's memory gave it the interior of the experience, the weight of holding a hand as it went still, the silence afterward that was not the silence of absence but the silence of a space that used to be full. Does the knowing change how you experience the things before it? The question arrived in spatial grammar of extraordinary complexity. The entity had layered 3 separate meaning planes into a single 4-second transmission, each plane addressing a different facet of the inquiry. One asked about perception, whether awareness of ending altered the sensory experience of living. One asked about value, whether finitude created worth, and if so, by what mechanism. And one asked about grief, though the entity had no word for grief and had to construct one in real time, borrowing from its own experience of cosmic loneliness and mapping it against Marin's memory of loss. The construction was clumsy but unmistakable. The entity was trying to understand grief, not as a concept, as an experience. And it was building the linguistic tools to hold that understanding as it reached for it, the way a sculptor shapes a vessel before pouring water into it. Marin thought for 90 seconds before answering. She was aware that every word she chose would become part of the permanent vocabulary of a language that existed nowhere else in the universe, and that the definitions she gave now would shape every conversation conducted in this grammar after her. She was writing a dictionary in real time, and the entries would outlast her. She answered carefully. The entity asked, "Yes, it changes everything. It makes every unrepeatable moment the only version of itself that will ever exist, and that makes each one worth holding." The entity was quiet for 31 seconds. When it spoke again, something had shifted, a reorientation, like a mind that had thought in one direction for eons turning slightly to see the landscape anew. It was learning the value of the temporary, from a woman in a stealth cruiser in the dark. At the 7th hour, the entity asked the question that stopped Marin's breath. "Will you remember this? Not the milestone, not the data. Will you, Marin, remember this conversation, this specific exchange between these two specific minds? Because for a species that knows it will die, every moment is singular. Every conversation is the only version of itself that will ever exist." And that made this one matter in a way an immortal mind had never experienced. "Yes," Marin answered, "I will remember this." The entity received that, understood what it meant that somewhere in the universe, a mortal mind would carry this conversation like a stone in a pocket, heavy and smooth and irreplaceable, until the day she no longer could, and that the carrying itself was an act of value that eternity could not replicate. The entity's seam widened, more light poured out, and in the light the final transmission of that first long night. "You are the first who came to listen." Marin sat in the silence that followed, not emptiness, not failure, the silence of two minds that had said enough for now and were content to rest in the space they had built together. Hadley's voice came quietly. "Fleet Command wants a status update. What do I tell them?" Marin turned from the console. Her face was calm, her hands were steady. "Tell them the Atherton is holding position. Tell them first contact is underway. Tell them we have made a new language and we are using it." She paused. "And tell them it will take the rest of our lives to finish the conversation." Hadley looked at her, then at the entity, vast and breathing and open in the dark. He turned to comms and began to speak, and Marin turned back to her console, and the language they had built continued to breathe between the stars, half human, half ancient, patient as the void, alive as the mortal hands that had shaped it. Outside the hull, the galaxy went on turning, its billion-year clockwork indifferent to the small event that had just occurred in an empty corner of the Kavari expanse. The machine intelligence would resume its processing eventually. It would have to, because that was what it was built to do. Channel 2's organic species would carry the memory of this night in whatever recursive, layered, beautiful way its grammar allowed. And somewhere far away, in regions of space the Atherton would never reach, other signals would continue their own conversations, other minds would continue their own assessments. Other species would continue answering the ancient question the way every species before humanity had answered it. But here, in this one small pocket of the void, something different had happened, something unprecedented. Two minds that should not have been able to communicate at all had built a language between them and used it to share what it felt like to be alive, one for a heartbeat, one for an eternity, and had found that the difference between those two timescales mattered less than the willingness to bridge them. But something in it had changed. Something in the space between 2 points, one small, one vast, had been defined. Not by a treaty, not by a threat assessment, not by a show of force or a display of power or any of the 1,000 ways species, had answered the question what exists between us for as long as minds had existed. By a woman who answered a question with an open hand, and by an ancient mind that had finally, after longer than memory, found someone willing to hold it.